Okay, so wonderful. Thank you. Thanks everybody for taking the time for that. But I think in a symposium, and that's what this is, symposiums are really conversations with wine. We're supposed to have wine. And actually, if you look up symposium, the Greeks, but we have water, so we do have fluids, but really the derivation of the whole phenomena of symposium was really founded with the Greeks and conversations that people would have, and usually over drinks, about issues that were important to them. And that's really what this is today. It's a conversation because I think everybody sort of wove through a very similar strand about this notion of feeling frustrated because either your sons or daughters or people that you care about are really not fully included into the community. And I wanted to introduce myself a little bit more and start our conversation theoretically with my own passage in terms of experiences. And so I introduced myself when we first started. I'm Al Condalusi, I'm from Pittsburgh. And I live on a hill with 17 Condalusi families, okay? And I want to tell you about Condalusi Hill because it's metaphorically a stepstone to what we want to examine today in terms of this idea of building bridges to relationships. My grandfather emigrated to the United States in 1915, lived in southern Italian community called Fagnana Castel in Calabria, made his way to the United States because he had a cousin who had come to the United States a couple years prior and began to write letters to my grandfather telling him how wonderful it was in Pittsburgh. And there were a lot of jobs were plentiful because of the steel mills, and the topographical sort of nature of the city reminded him a lot of Italy. There were a lot of Italians who already came to Pittsburgh to work in the steel mills. So our cousin Guido was writing to Grandpa saying, "You got to come to the United States." Finally, my grandfather got enough courage to get on that boat in Naples and sail over to the United States with his wife, my grandmother, Generina, and their little baby, Maria, my Aunt Mary, right? So they make their way to Ellis Island in New York City, get processed through with all the big movement of immigrants happening at the turn of the century, and get on a train at Grand Central Station for Pittsburgh. They arrive in Pittsburgh, and waiting for them at the train station was my grandfather, or my grandfather's cousin Guido. He was like standing like this, with his arms open. And Grandpa, Antonio, and Generina get off the train, and Guido gives them a big hug and welcomes them to a new culture, to a new world. Right? Now, Guido was functioning for my grandpa and grandma as a gatekeeper. And sociologically, I'm going to talk about gatekeepers and the role they play in bridge building and how important they are in terms of some of the processes that we were going to look at. But Guido was Grandpa's gatekeeper, first gatekeeper. And what gatekeepers do, they're already members of the culture. So they're indigenous to the existing culture. And they open the gates and welcome in somebody new to the culture. That's what gatekeepers do. And what Guido did for Grandpa was help him find a place to live, help him find a job, help him find the Italian grocery store where he could get his meats and vegetables, helped him find a church because, religion is important to all of us. And so he did all these sort of bridging to these various component parts of community for Grandpa. Grandpa couldn't speak English. Guido knew enough English to be able to help negotiate with the landlord, to negotiate, with the merchants. So Guido sort of opened a new world to my grandpa. And Guido was also very well liked. And what we know about gatekeepers, the reason they play an important role is a sociological concept called value-image juxtaposition. It's a big word, simple concept. If somebody already is in the community, already in the culture, wherever it might be, and they have a value in that culture, they're valued by the other members of the culture, when they endorse something new or someone new, the new person's value begins to rise based on the gatekeeper, not on them specifically, because they're still unknown. They're still alien to that new culture. They're brand new. So the gatekeeper, who already is known, transitions his or her value to the new person. That happened for me here, right? So Sharon, who we all know and love, and you guys didn't come to hear me. You came because Sharon invited you, right? And you value Sharon. You know that she's not going to sponsor something that's not going to be useful for you. She understands, she's passionate about a better community. And so Sharon's value, which is high in your eyes, got you here today. And then when Sharon stands up side by side with me and says, I want you to meet Al Condalusi, he's going to talk about social capital, my value started to rise in some of your eyes, right? Maybe not everybody, but in some of your eyes, the value of Sharon transitioned to me. That value shift is really important in the penetration into a new culture. Because if somebody is an alien for whatever reason, they just never have been there before, maybe they look different, maybe their behaviors are a little bit different, that sort of behavior will create a wall. And unless that wall is facilitated by somebody who's valued, that wall will remain high. And it will not only remain high, it'll end up causing the person to want to leave. So the gatekeeper, which was the role Guido played for Grandpa Antonio, was a critical ingredient we're going to look at a little bit more strategically as we kind of go down this path. So Grandpa rents a home on a hillside. Guido helped him negotiate it, and he starts his work. He worked at the steel mill. Guido helped him get a job at the steel mill. And so Grandpa and Grandma, on those cold winter nights in Pittsburgh, a lot of cold winter nights, they'd cuddle. And as they cuddled, more Condalusis came. So within a quick period of time, there were 9 Condalusi kids, my dad being one of them. My dad's name was Sinbaldo, right? And so as Grandpa's family got bigger, he wanted to augment and supplement his income from the mill. So he got permission from the doctor who owned the hilltop. He was living in a home on a hillside. The hilltop was just virgin, wild area. And he got permission to put a garden there and to keep goats there. As when Grandpa lived in Italy, that was his job. He took care of goats. So, but the bargain he made with the guy who owned it, a doctor who owned that property, was he would give him tomatoes, zucchini, goat's milk, goat cheese for the use of the land, right? Bartering. That's a sociological construct called reciprocity, right? And we do that all the time. We barter. With our friends, with people that we know, we sort of make deal. You scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. You help me with this, I'll help you with that. That kind of notion of our connectedness, that's also another really key point of social capital, is reciprocity. So Grandpa gets permission to use the hilltop. He gets his garden going, gets his goats, and of course comes home from the mill dog-tired because of all the physical work in that mill. My grandpa actually shoveled coal in the blast furnaces that smelted the steel. He'd come home dog-tired. He'd take his kids. They'd go up to the hilltop, and they would take care of the tomatoes. They'd take care of the goats. And so as my dad and his brothers and sisters got older, they spent a lot of time on that hill. They loved being up there. And then, of course, when they came of age, they brought their girlfriends up behind the goat shed. They learned about life. And so they made a pact. My dad and my uncle Sanguine made a pact that they were going to buy this hill, right? And they were going to move their family up there. as they were now getting married, they were coming of age. And so they did. They went to the same doctor that Grandpa had been making goat's milk for and goat cheese and tomatoes. Dr. Harrington was his name. And they asked if they could buy the hilltop. And they made him an offer he couldn't refuse. That's a little Italian joke, huh? Don't go there. But they got permission, a handshake deal, no bank, no mortgages, just $25 a month for the next 15 years, 20 years, or whatever it was. And they bought 4 acres of property. And the very first thing they did was built a home for Grandpa right next to the goat shed on the hilltop. And then they built homes for each other. Right? So when I was born, 1948, there were 8 Condalusi families up on this hill. They built the road up to the top of the hill. It was just family. And growing up in that environment was really amazing as I look back on it now, right? That the love, the support, the unconditional regard that everyone got just because we were familia, right? We were family, was huge. It didn't matter how handsome you were, how smart you were, how fast you were. It mattered because you were a member of the tribe. That's what mattered. You were just a member of the tribe. And so growing up on that hill was incredibly idyllic for me. And I had basically 8 mothers and 8 fathers. I couldn't do none of us could do anything that somebody didn't catch. All right? So we had the guidance and the direction. But I had 40 cousins who were like brothers and sisters because we all just shared the hill. We played on the hill. And my best friend was my cousin Carrie, who lived right next door. And my Uncle Will and my Aunt Florence's daughter, Carrie. And we were the same age. Carrie was 6 months older than me, so we were sort of joined at the hip. And on big families like that, kids that are the same age always sort of are cohorted together. And so it was me, Carrie, my cousin Denny, my cousin Ronnie. We were like the 4 amigos. We were always together. And the first time we got separated was when we went to school, me, Denny, and Ronnie, for the first time. Carrie didn't go to school. Right? So we go down, we're going to school, all the Condalusis gather in the morning on the hill, we walk down to the school. Carrie stayed back. And so for about 5-6 days, going to school, we'd walk home for lunch, never ate in the cafeteria, never took a school bus. We just walked to school, walked back for lunch, walked back to school, walked back at the end of the day. But Carrie was always just on the hill hanging out. And so I asked my mother, I said, Mom, how come Carrie doesn't go to school? And my mom says, honey, she can't learn. She's different. I said, what? I said, what do you mean? My mom says, honey, she has a thing called Down syndrome. And so it really affects her ability to learn. I said, but Mommy, I know that Carrie can learn because Carrie played every game we played on the streets, hide and go seek and, different board games. And Carrie could do all the same things that all the rest of us could do. So I asked my mom, I said, what do you mean, Mama, that Carrie can't learn? And my mom says, honey, she can learn, but she just learns differently. And the schools don't know how to teach her. And so she doesn't have to go to school. I said, Mama, you mean to tell me if you have Down syndrome, you don't have to go to school? And my mama said, yeah. I said, can I catch Down syndrome from Carrie? I don't want to go to school either. Who wants to go to school? But it was very innocent introduction for me about who's welcomed in the community and who's not. And Carrie wasn't welcomed in school. Right? And as we got a little bit older, and we started, all the Condalusis would go down to the community for street fairs and festivals and church things and football games on Friday night. All the Condalusi contingency would kind of go down to these events. And my mom would tell me as I would leave the hill, keep an eye on Carrie. Just make sure Carrie's okay. Carrie came with us on those events. But when we went to those events, I also observed how she was treated. Right? Some of the kids made fun of her. Carrie had a cleft palate, so she couldn't really enunciate words very well. So her speech was garbled. We understood her, but other kids made fun of her. They mocked her speech. They played jokes on her. And of course, Carrie needed things concretized, and they would do things that would taunt her to the point where she would start to cry or feel embarrassed. And then I would get angry. And of course, my job was to protect Carrie. And so I would end up fighting with a lot of these kids who made fun of Carrie. And I just couldn't understand how people could be so mean to somebody they didn't even know. Right? I mean, I just didn't understand that. And so I became Carrie's protector. And when kids would make fun of Carrie, they would have to go through me. And now Pittsburgh's a crusty town. It's a blue-collar town, and we come from a blue-collar family, and I know how to fight. And I got into a lot of fights protecting Carrie. And every once in a while, big kid would make fun of Carrie, and I'd say, oh, shit. Take that back. And I would get my butt kicked. But in reality, what began to happen to me was this sort of notion that I had to change this, that this wasn't right, the way people treated Carrie. It just wasn't right. And so as I came of age to start thinking about what I wanted to do when I graduated, remember all the kids, when you were in 11th grade and 12th grade, kids were talking about, what are you going to do when you graduate? You're going to get a job, you're going to do this, you're going to do that. And I would always tell my counselors that I want to help people like Carrie. And my counselors would say, well, Carrie is different. It's like the second time I started hearing this difference thing, right? She's different. And if you really want to help Carrie, you have to understand her difference. That's what I was told, right? And I was told this by teachers that I respected. And so I said, well, what do I have to do? And they said, well, you have to go to college because Carrie has a problem. And if you go to college, you could learn how to help Carrie with her problem. People like Carrie. So what do I know? I was one of the first Condalusis to go to college. In fact, I remember my grandpa, he grabbed me by the cheeks. He said, you go to college, you get the smart, you come back, you help with the family. I said, that's right, Grandpa. I'm going to go get smart and help the family. Right? So I go off to college, and I studied disability and disability policy, disability issues, different diagnoses, big books about disability, and classes on abnormal behavior and dysfunctional people. Right? And all that stuff that I started to get exposed to was about the fact that Carrie has a problem, and the problem is her. She has a problem that rests inside her, and the problem is her. Carrie is the problem. We have a Down syndrome problem. We have an autism problem. We have a cerebral palsy problem. And we've got to figure out how to help these guys and gals who have these problems. And so I learn strategies to intervene with people who have problems, right? And we give all kinds of names for their problems, and you know all the names. And so I graduate from college. I learn all this stuff about their problem. Here's what I learned. Carrie has a problem, and the problem is in her. It's in Carrie. She has a chromosome, an extra chromosome, right? And that the problem actually has a name. In fact, when Carrie was born, the name was Mongolism. That was actually on her birth certificate. Mongoloid baby girl was how she was labeled when she was born. So, but we have to label these problems in order to really help them. Not only do we label them, but then we have to have an assessment of their problem and then a treatment plan. Right? So we have to assess and then treat the problem. So this is sort of what I learned. And the goal here is to fix these problems. to fix Carrie. Right? So that's a micro-clinical model. And it's a treatment model you've been introduced to. You parents have been told that your sons and daughters have a problem. The problem has a name. It has manifestations. And there are things we can do to try to mitigate those manifestations. We can intervene with medicine, with therapy, with other kinds of treatment plans, right? That's a classic micro clinical medical model. And it pervades disability and disability policy, pervades it. Right? And so I come back to Pittsburgh and I get a job with the organization I'm still with now. It's called CLASS, Community Living and Support Services. At the time I joined the organization, it was called UCP. Right? UCP stands for United Cerebral Palsy. Right? So it was a diagnostic organization like ARC, like MS Society, like the Williams Syndrome Foundation, Down Syndrome Society, with a name and an energy toward that diagnosis. So I come back to CLASS and I start to build programs to help people like Carrie. Now, the goal here that we have are simple. Every family that I've ever talked to, including, of course, my own family, has some goals or some visions in mind, right? And so your goal is that your son and daughter are healthy, are happy. Your goal is that they can get a job. Your goal is that they can get a place to live. Your goal is that they can get around the community. And your goal is that they have friends. So I talk to thousands of families in my practice, including my own family. And these are the goals. This is what you want, quite simply, for your son or daughter. Doesn't matter whether they have a disability or not. This is universal parent 101, right? This is what we want for our kids. We want them to be healthy. We want them to be happy. We want them to be able to get a job, make some money, be able to, find an identity. We want them to be able to move out of our place and get their own place at some point. We want them to be able to get around the community. And we want them to get friends, right? This is not rocket science. This is parenting 101 for any of us that have children. This is what we want for our kids. So this is what we wanted for Carrie. And what I was exposed to in college was this is the way we get this, is to do this. If we can do this, we can achieve this. That's what I was told. And so I start doing special programs, separate programs, skill building programs, therapeutic sort of interventions to try to see that unfold. And about 5 years into my practice, this is around 1973, 74, I took an inventory and said, gee, is this happening for the people we support? Are people with disabilities healthy, happy? Do they have jobs? Do they have places to live? Do they have, rides and ways to get around the community? And began to discover that the outcomes weren't very good. And if you look at any outcome measure in any of those bulleted areas, you'll discover that people with disabilities are still behind the 8 ball on every one of those measures. And in some cases, tragically behind the 8 ball. So these micro programs that we were doing really weren't achieving the goals that families told me they wanted, right? So I began to rethink, right? This micro model sees Carrie as the problem and does all this activity to Carrie. But maybe Carrie isn't the problem. Maybe the reason she doesn't have those things in the same abundance that other people do is not because of Carrie, but because of the community. Right? So now this is an incredible paradigm shift, when you begin to shift from seeing the person with the disability as having a problem to seeing that the community is the problem. Right? The community is the problem. That is a shift from micro to macro. In this, Carrie has the problem. In this, the community has the problem. Now this is huge. It's a paradigm shift. It's sort of a mental model shift that's hard for us to make because we've been so bombarded by the micro. It's the Down syndrome, it's the Williams syndrome, it's the autism, it's the multiple sclerosis, it's this, it's that. That becomes the boogeyman that has to be sort of mitigated or changed, that we lose sight of the fact that the problem might be here. Because we're sold a false idol here, that somehow, some way, if Carrie could be normalized, then the society will accept her, which literally is an insult to Carrie, because Carrie is who she is. She's God made her just as she is, and she's okay just the way she is. The problem here is society doesn't see Carrie's relevance. They think Carrie's better off over at ARC, or over at Easter Seal, or over at MS Society, or over at Pick Your Problem. That's where they think she's better off. Because society defaults back to this micro model. Now, I started to challenge this micro model in the early 70s. And so I go back to school. And I figure, I learned that and it didn't work. So maybe this can help with those outcomes, right? So I go back to school and I start working on a master's in social work, focusing on community. How do we change the community? Rather than how do we change Carrie, how do we change the community? That's micro to macro. And so I start studying community. And now this is the 70s, the early 70s. 73, I started back on my graduate work. And what I started to learn from my professors was that the way we change the community is we look at and change the rules that dictate what community should do. That we change the rules. And so I became this radical change agent, changing the community through rules, through new laws. And so in 1975, we passed Public Law 94-142. That was the first time kids with disabilities had the right to go to school. 1975, we passed Public Law 94-142. In 1978, we passed the Vocational Rehabilitation Act that said people with disabilities have a right to a job and that they become the most important player in getting jobs. 1978. In 1979, we passed the Urban Mass Transit Act that said that people with disabilities now have the right to ride public vehicles. And then in 1980, we passed the Urban and Housing Development Act that said that people with disabilities now have the right to live in the community and public housing should be made available to them. Right? We passed these laws. In 1990, we passed the coup de grace called the ADA. It was the Civil Rights Act for people with disabilities. It said that there will be no more discrimination based on disability in the United States of America. People with disabilities have a right to everything. 1990, we passed that bill. And so I started doing this, right? I'm chaining myself to buses. We're occupying buildings. We're just doing all this radical stuff. We're changing laws. But stopped and looked at, was the outcomes changing for people with disabilities? Were they getting any better? And the answer was no. And the notion that we can change behavior through passing a law is really not a viable strategy. Now, passing laws is important in a society like the United States. So, I'm still very much pro changing laws that will become more inclusive and more welcoming and create a much more diverse society. I get that. And I think we need to know that and do that. But we know today that just by passing a law is not going to change the behavior of somebody to be nice to my cousin Carrie. That's not going to, we can't mandate a moral sort of thing. We can't say, you have to be nice. The ADA says, you got to be nice, Iris, to people with disabilities. Right? That just doesn't work that way. So I go back to college, right? I figure there's got to be something that's going to help me with this. And so I'm in graduate school working on my doctorate. This is in 1984. And so I'm on campus taking my classes and, getting ready to start my dissertation. And a friend comes up to me and says, Al, there's a lecture tonight on campus. There's a guy coming in from Harvard to talk about social capital. And I said, what's social capital? He says, I don't know. That's why I'm going to the lecture. He said, do you want to come to the lecture with me? I said, is this about disability? He said, I don't know what it's about. He said, but it sounds intriguing. And so I said, okay, I'll go. So I go to this lecture, and I don't know if you've ever had this experience where when, you're sitting somewhere and all of a sudden the stars and the moon begin to align and, the clouds begin to sort of part and you see a vision that you hadn't seen before. And it might have been the lecture, it might have just been the right, cells were firing, the synapses were happening in a different way. But all of a sudden, listening to Dr. Robert Putnam introduce some of the work that he was doing, his early work on social capital, became an aha moment for me. And I said, this is it. This is it. And so I started to dive into everything and anything I could find related to relationships and social capital. Because what Putnam was saying, and what all the evidence is really clear, is that rules will raise consciousness, but it's relationships that change behavior. And it's behavior that facilitates these things to happen. It's behavioral change on the part of the community, macro, that makes these things begin to happen. Because, people getting jobs is really about the average guy who's hiring to sort of open his or her mind about who they want to hire. Right? It's not. Here's what's happened to us in human services. We try to get people in the community to get people jobs, and they just back away, and so we end up creating group employment things, sheltered workshops, and enclaves, and separate sort of things, because the greater community doesn't see the relevance of Carrie, or your son, or your daughter, or the person that got you here today. And so this idea of social capital became, for me, the fundamental piece of the puzzle. And what we want to do today is really look at social capital. We want to look at it strategically. We want to define it. We want to talk a little bit about what we know about it. And mostly, we want to talk about how do we harness it and utilize it in supporting folks who have been left behind. And the key to social capital is not that this is not a disability thing. This is a human relations thing. It's about, social capital is absolutely critical to all of us, to any of us. Now, I teach a human relations class at the University of Pittsburgh in the School of Health and Rehab Sciences, where I have my appointment. And we teach it to our students not as a disability strategy. We teach it as a strategy they can use in their own lives to broaden their networks so that they can achieve life success. So it's a universal phenomenon. We do know, however, that vulnerable people, whether they're vulnerable because of disability, because of age, because of poverty, because of racial background, because of sexual orientation, vulnerable people have less social capital. And that if somebody is rendered vulnerable, they lose social capital. If people are born vulnerable, they never build it in the first place. And so there's a huge void between the relationship patterns and relationship situations for vulnerable people, not just people with disabilities. So this is a broader strategy in dealing with the disparities that vulnerability create in our society. Okay? So I just want to pause now. We're going to take a break so that folks can move around a little bit, get some more to eat or drink. Bathrooms, by the way, are back over in men's room on the right side, women's on the left side, out in the hallway there. And then when we come back, what we want to do is introduce social capital. I want to define it. I want to sort of look at some of its salient parts, some of the moving parts of it, and really begin to sort of pull out some of the things we can use strategically for your daughter, for my cousin, for people that you care about, in terms of building bridges back to the greater community. This is about changing the minds and the hearts of the everyday citizen. It's not about fixing disability. It's about broadening perspective in the greater culture. Okay? So just a little time check. Where are we with time, Jeff? 20 to 11. So if we can take 10, 15 minutes, get back before 11, we can, within that last hour, we'll get into the theory and the definition, and then that'll set us up for lunch, and then we come back to the strategies. Okay? So we'll take a 10, 15 minute break.